friends, Ginny D here, and I get a lot of questions about learning to sew for cosplay. Unfortunately, I struggle with these questions sometimes because I myself did not learn to sew for cosplay. I learned to sew from my mom when I was just a kid. She sewed our Halloween costumes and matching pajamas for the family for Christmas, and for a very brief and terrible time, matching Easter clothes for my brother and I to wear to church. Thankfully, that one was short-lived. I started out hand sewing t-shirts and sleeping bags for Beanie Babies out of scraps of fleece and felt, and then eventually graduated to bigger and bigger projects under my mom's careful guidance, until just before I got started cosplaying, when I was using my sewing skills to create costumes to wear to the local Renaissance festival. To be honest, I am seriously impressed with anyone who learns to sew for cosplay specifically. I was very lucky to enter this hobby with a basic foundation, and even I still feel inadequate and unprepared for a huge percentage of the projects I take on. Sewing, I'm not gonna lie to you, is challenging. It's one of those skills that you just have to put the hours into. That's the only way to get better. But for those of you who want to put the hours in and don't have a mom like mine to walk you through the basics and help you read sewing patterns, allow me to temporarily be your sewing mom. There is a level of necessary investment to begin sewing. It is a material craft, so you need materials and the tools to work with them. Here are the absolute basics that you'll need in your sewing room before you can get started. Fabric. You'll need fabric to sew with. If you're just practicing, or if you have some flexibility with material and color, I would highly recommend visiting a thrift store or a yard sale and picking up some old bed sheets. It's the cheapest way to get a hold of a lot of cotton fabric. If you can't find anything secondhand, the next best option is probably just to visit your local fabric store and pick up some muslin. This is a cheap fabric often used to make mock-ups, which are basically practice garments. At Joann Fabrics, it's $2.99 a yard, and Joann's is coupon heaven, so you shouldn't even have to pay that. Especially for beginning sewists, it's a good idea to practice with a disposable fabric first, so that you don't risk ruining whatever special fabric you have for your costume. Thread. For the final garment, you'll want thread that matches your fabric, but when you're practicing, you can pretty much use anything. I highly recommend scouting thrift stores and yard sales for thread too. I have a few boxes of spools of thread that came from various old ladies, and I haven't had to buy thread for like 3 years. In general, you'll want all-purpose polyester or cotton thread. It's cheap and it's strong. Avoid specialty threads like metallic, upholstery, or invisible thread until you already have a basic handle on sewing. Pins. Pins are different from needles. Needles have a hole in the end for your thread, whereas pins have little balls on the end to prevent them from slipping through your fabric. Their purpose is to hold your fabric in place before you sew it. Quick lesson on pinning. Beginners like to try and pin fabric like this. This won't do anything, it'll come right out. Instead, you want to stick the pin down through the fabric and then back up. Don't skip pins, they're super important and they're not even expensive. Scissors. You don't need to invest in dressmaker's shears right off the bat, although I highly recommend them once you can afford them. All you really need is a pair of scissors that's sharp and will cut easily through fabric. Some fabrics are delicate and will get easily shredded by bad scissors. Plus, cutting out pattern pieces already kind of sucks, so don't make it harder on yourself with dull scissors. Needles. You'll need hand sewing needles for things like applying snaps or buttons or hand finishing the odd internal seam that can't be done on the machine. You can usually get 20 or 30 hand needles for about $5, which should last you for a really long time. I've been sewing seriously for about a decade now, and I only just bought my second pack a few weeks ago. Sewing machine. It is my opinion that you should get a hold of a sewing machine as soon as you can. You learn sewing by doing sewing, and while hand sewing is an essential skill for any sewist, in general, you will learn a lot slower if it takes you 10 or 20 times as long to complete every single seam. Sewing machines can do a lot of things, from buttonholes to zippers to decorative stitches, so the sooner you start learning, the more useful a machine will be to you. Now, that doesn't mean you have to go out and drop $1,000 on a top-of-the-line model. You can literally get a sewing machine at Walmart for $20. I'm not necessarily suggesting that you do that. If you can afford to drop more like $75 or $100, you can get a better quality machine that will last you longer and be capable of more. It's also a good idea to check out places like eBay, where you can sometimes get a really great machine secondhand for a good price. I don't have a sewing machine recommendation. I'm using a hand-me-down from my mom, a Kenmore Elite that I love and has served me very well, but I would recommend you do a little of your own research. Read some Consumer Reports articles, look up what machines are good for beginners, and figure out the best option based on your budget. All you really need is a machine that can do a straight stitch, a back stitch, and a zigzag stitch. Anything beyond that should be considered a bonus at this point. Finally, you'll need a pattern. Now, you won't always be sewing with a pattern. Eventually, you might end up patterning your own garments using math or draping or other garments as a guide. But I highly recommend that you start learning sewing by using commercial patterns. This will teach you the basics of how garments come together, like what a sleeve looks like when it's laid flat, or how to apply a collar. It'll also teach you a lot of basic functional skills like basting, hemming, ease stitching, gathering, etc. Fair warning, commercial patterns are not very easy to read. A lot of times they feel like they're written in a different language, but you can search for the keywords and phrases that are included in the instructions to find YouTube videos and blog tutorials that explain them. It can be very frustrating to spend 25 or 30 minutes trying to decipher one weirdly worded, confusing step, and trust me, I've done it. But it's worth it to learn the right way to do things before you start experimenting. One of those learn the rules before you break them things. You can get sewing patterns online or at your local fabric store. Make sure you get them in the right size for you. There are measurement charts on the back because often the numbered sizes listed on patterns don't match with what you're used to seeing in clothing stores. The back of the pattern also tells you how much fabric to get and what kind. Again, it can be difficult to read before you understand how it's written, so don't be shy about looking up guides and tutorials online or asking for help. Inside the packet will be a few pages of instructions, which are usually printed on a newsprint like this, and then a bunch of giant sheets of thin brown paper. These are the actual pattern pieces. The instructions will tell you how to cut out and lay out those pattern pieces on your fabric yardage, and then it will walk you through, step by step, the garment construction process. That should just about cover all the basics, but I wanted to mention a few optional things that are nice to have around if you can manage it. A measuring tape is useful and cheap, and unlike a ruler or a yardstick, you can wrap it around 3D shapes, like to take your measurements. A pin cushion will be useful to prevent losing your pins or worse, stepping on them. An iron and an ironing board will seriously level up your sewing and make everything neater. A seam ripper will help you pull out seams that you did wrong without ruining your fabric, and trust me, you'll use it a lot. I use it pretty much every time I sew. And finally, a rotary cutter and a cutting mat make cutting straight edges easy and precise. Once you have all your materials, it's pretty straightforward. You just need to sew something. Follow the instructions on your pattern as best you can, and don't be afraid to Google even the smallest, stupidest things. And if you don't think you've gotten it right, pull it out and try again. If you're really stuck on a pattern, join a sewing group on Facebook and post pictures and ask for help. Or ask a friend or a family member who has sewing experience to help you out. I know this sounds like a cop-out where the ultimate answer to how to sew is sew. But the fact is that sewing is a hugely complicated hobby to take on, and there are more facets to it than anyone could teach you in a single video or even a single book. Instead, you will be constantly learning. You will choose a project, it will challenge you, and you'll learn new skills to surmount those obstacles. Trust me, you will sew some bad stuff. You will mess up, you will get stuck. You will put hours and blood and sweat and tears into a garment that comes out as ugly as sin. But you will also surprise yourself. You'll be a quick learner. You'll make things that you can't believe you created with your own hands. And slowly, over time, you will learn. Things that scared you at first will become easier, and you'll find new techniques to scare you. That is the beauty and the horror of sewing. One of my favorite proverbs is, "The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is now." It will likely take you years to become a confident sewist, but I look back at the ways that I challenged myself when I first started cosplaying 8 years ago now, and I'm glad that I took on projects that scared me. I'm glad that I decided to learn to sew a corset. I'm glad that I didn't give up on zippers. I'm glad that I've sewn so many circle skirts that I can put one together in an hour. Whenever I run into a sewing technique I don't know, I tell myself that future me will only know it if I do the work of learning it now. So good luck doing the work. Future you, who is confident and capable at the sewing machine, who makes beautiful cosplays that they're justly proud of, will thank you. Check out my tutorial playlist for more specific sewing tutorials, and feel free to let me know in the comments if there's a sewing video that you would like to see from me.